All rise. The cry rang out like thunder across the imposing, wood-furnished courtroom, quieting the noise of reporters and spectators jammed into the gallery. Tension hung heavy in the air, the kind that buzzes just before a storm. Cameras flashed wildly as writers elbowed each other aside, their flashes illuminating the serious faces of those sitting at the front. And there, at the center of the tempest, was Kody Brown, his once reassured stance now burdened by the weight of the accusations against him. Formerly hailed as the charismatic patriarch of a far-flung polygamous clan, Kody now endured the public embarrassment of being labeled a criminal, charged with masterminding a multi-million-dollar financial defalcation that had destroyed his family. For over 2 decades, Kody had carefully cultivated the image of a devoted husband and father. His family, showcased on national television, was portrayed as a bold experiment in plural love. Unconventional, yes, but deeply united. He preached about trust, shared responsibility, and collective prosperity. He often spoke about how what's mine is theirs, and how every financial decision was made with the family's future in mind. But as the prosecution would ultimately contend, those lofty words were merely a facade, one that hid a much uglier reality. Behind the closed doors, the business empire Kody built on the backs of his wives and children was full of lies. The wives, Meri, Janelle, Christine, and Robyn, had long left their finances in the hands of Kody. And besides, he was the patriarch of the family, the one who brokered their television contracts, managed their property investments, and controlled the companies that they founded together. But over time, cracks crept into those tough exteriors. Janelle, the practical and detail-conscious wife, was the first to realize that something was amiss. Her spreadsheets, to which she was faithfully devoted, began to reflect bizarre discrepancies. Revenue that had been supposed to be paid into their joint accounts was gone, unbudgeted expenses that nobody could explain kept turning up, and bank balances changed mysteriously. She initially dismissed it as accounting mistakes. But the figures would not add up, and when she attempted to seek clarification, Kody's answers were vague. "Don't worry about it," he'd tell her. "It's just part of a grander investment strategy. Trust me." Those words may have been enough a decade ago, but by then trust had eroded. The wives were increasingly exasperated with Kody's secretive nature, especially Christine, who had already left him after years of emotional abandonment. Her frustration gave way to suspicion, and suspicion gave way to action. It was Christine who found the first irrefutable evidence, a sequence of emails that Kody had left logged onto an open family computer. The exchanges were with a financial advisor and concerned directions on how to transfer money into offshore and out-of-sight accounts. There were worrying allusions to shell companies, Cayman Islands investment vehicles, and a very incriminating note: "They'll never trace this back if we route it through the Nevada Trust first." Christine's heart gave a jolt as she read that. The man she once thought would defend their family had been quietly constructing a financial stronghold, one that was closed to everyone except him. Christine immediately called Meri and Janelle, and the three began digging deeper. What they found was worse than they could have dreamed. During 8 years, Kody had systematically drained over $2 million from their shared ventures, their profit from their TLC show, proceeds from the sale of property, and income from their wife-owned businesses. The funds had gone into secret accounts, been used to buy luxury items in someone else's name, and even invested in projects that none of the wives was aware of. At the same time, Kody had been telling them over and over again that the family was struggling financially, putting pressure on them to economize, reduce, and even pay in from their own side businesses. The wives took the betrayal like a sledgehammer. It wasn't about the money, it was about the deception, the fibs, the intentional exploitation of their trust. Meri, who had survived the shame of Kody's emotional withdrawal and public catfishing affair, felt a fresh type of devastation. Janelle, who had labored hard to keep the family economically afloat, was deeply betrayed. And Christine, who had left the marriage in the hope of reclaiming her dignity, was now filled with righteous rage. Even Robyn, Kody's legal wife and most supportive ally, was shaken. Although she initially defended him, the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Together, the women made a choice that would change it all. They would sue Kody. The civil lawsuit they brought alleged that he had embezzled millions of dollars in family money, defrauded them of their rightful portion, and breached several financial contracts. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was public judgment, a statement that they would no longer be silent victims of his exploitation. The morning the trial opened, the courthouse was buzzing with reporters. The case had attracted national interest, not only because of the family's reality TV celebrity, but because of the salaciousness of the allegations. Headlines screamed, "Sister Wives Scandal, Kody Brown charged with $2 million fraud and Brown family implodes in courtroom confrontation." At the courthouse, tension was in the air. The wives perched on one side of the courtroom, together for the first time in years. Kody and his legal team sat alone on the other side, his once authoritative presence worn down by the burden of public shame. As the judge entered and brought down her gavel, the sound appeared to echo through every nook and cranny of the courtroom, a sign that the days of secrecy were behind them. "This court is now in session," the judge announced. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on the man who once was the master builder of a family dynasty, and now sat charged with dismantling it for selfish reasons. The opening statements were explosive. The prosecution painted Kody as a master manipulator, who had built a financial labyrinth to enrich himself while leaving his family in the dark. They promised to present evidence, bank statements, email trails, and witness testimony that would expose a decade-long pattern of deceit. The defense, for its part, painted Kody as a misguided businessman, stating that all of his actions were in the best interests of the family, and that the wives were driven by vengeance, not justice. But beyond the legal rhetoric and theatrics in the courtroom, one irrefutable reality loomed over everything. This trial was about something greater than money. It was about betrayal and distrust. It was four women taking back their strength from a man who had exercised dominance for way too long. And as the first witness set to testify on the stand, the world held its collective breath, aware that the Brown household, once a beacon of unorthodox love, had become a warning tale of greed, trickery, and the cost of betrayal. The gavel had dropped, and the fight for justice had only just started. The courtroom. News had traveled far and wide beyond the courthouse. News had traveled far and wide beyond the courthouse walls. Television news stations were providing live reports. Twitter was on fire with the hashtags #BrownFamilyBetrayal and #Kody on trial. And former fans of the one-time darling reality TV dad were sitting in shocked disbelief, as the man who preached trust and harmony was accused of destroying his own family's financial security. But for prosecutor Laura Kent, this was not just a celebrity trial. It was about revealing the truth. And today, she was prepared to incinerate the courtroom with evidence that would destroy what remained of Kody Brown's carefully constructed reputation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Kent started as she stood up, each word biting and careful, "today you will witness the reality. Not the smiling TV man, not the father who talked of religion and family, but the mastermind of a premeditated plan to cheat the people closest to him. This was no mishap. This was premeditated. This was betrayal to the nth degree." The jury leaned forward, their eyes completely focused on her. Kody squirmed uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer whispering something in his ear, but his face betrayed a glimmer of panic he could no longer conceal. Kent did not hesitate. The first bit of evidence she presented was a string of bank statements, page after page of transactions that indicated huge amounts of money were being transferred from the family's joint accounts into a succession of business accounts held entirely in Kody's name. The amounts were different: $25,000 one time, $50,000 another. But over the course of a few years, the figure mounted to more than $2 million. More incriminating still was the destination of the funds: shell corporations based in Nevada, Delaware, and even the Cayman Islands. These corporations had no staff, no facilities, and no actual business to conduct. They were purely vehicles to conceal money. The prosecution then produced a series of emails that left the court reeling. In one, Kody instructed a financial advisor to keep the accounts off any statements that go to the wives. In another, he explicitly referred to his family as unnecessary liabilities and suggested that certain transactions be reclassified as business expenses to avoid drawing attention. One message in particular drew audible gasps from the gallery. Once the Nevada property is secured, I'll be in a position to cut ties cleanly. They'll never see it coming. It was a haunting piece of evidence, not only financial dishonesty, but cold-blooded betrayal. Then Kent summoned Christine Brown to testify. Christine had already become somewhat of a public figure of resistance since breaking away from Kody, and now she was willing to confront him in court. She walked by the defense table without even looking his way. Her poise was firm, but her voice shook a bit as she lifted her right hand and swore the oath. "Christine," Kent started softly, "can you tell us in the court when you first realized something was amiss with the family finances?" Christine inhaled deeply. "It began on a small scale," she explained. "I saw that we weren't reaching financial targets we had set together. We were skimping, canceling vacations, putting off projects, even though we were more profitable than ever." Kody always had a reason. "The profits of the show are deferred," he'd tell her. Or the real estate transaction didn't work out. But something didn't sit with her. She continued to explain how she accidentally discovered the incriminating emails, how her finding escalated to a full-blown investigation, and how devastated she felt to learn that the man she had trusted with her entire life had been scheming his exit strategy all these years. "He informed us that we were a team," Christine said, her voice cracking. "We created businesses together. We raised children together. And the whole time he was depositing money into accounts we didn't even know we had. This wasn't an error. It was a scheme to abandon us." The cross-examination by Kody's lawyer attempted to portray Christine as bitter and vindictive. "You bear a personal vendetta against my client, don't you?" he asked. "You walked out of the marriage. Isn't it true that you're bringing this lawsuit out of spite?" Christine looked him straight in the eye. "I left because I was lied to," she replied firmly. "And I'm here because he stole from us. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability." The next witness, Janelle Brown, brought the trial's emotional temperature even higher. Known for her financial savvy and meticulous record-keeping, Janelle's testimony was nothing short of devastating for Kody's defense. She presented spreadsheets dating back more than a decade, a financial history of the family's income and expenses that she had personally maintained. "I can show you to the penny how much we made and where it was supposed to go," she said. "And I can show you precisely where the discrepancies are." She led the jury through a series of transactions that were red flags. "Here," she said, touching a line on one document, "we sold a piece of property for $750,000. That money should have been put into our joint account. Instead, $300,000 was the rest spent directly on an organization named Kodiak Holdings. We had no idea what that was. We didn't sign off on it." Asked who owned Kodiak Holdings, Janelle responded quickly. "Kody did. He was the only signatory." Kent then dropped another bombshell: high-end consumer purchases with those diverted monies. Evidence revealed that Kody had bought a $1.2 million Nevada property in an assumed name, including a private pool, home theater, and high-end cars parked in the driveway. He also bought into a boutique business investment with a past business partner, again without disclosing it to the family, and he informed his wives that they would have to take out loans simply to pay property taxes on Coyote Pass. The reaction in the courtroom was visceral. Journalists wrote furiously, jurors looked at each other in horror, and even some of Kody's strongest supporters in the crowd shook their heads in amazement. The prosecution was not just presenting a case. They were deconstructing his credibility brick by brick. Perhaps the most poignant moment was when Daniel Brown, one of Kody's adult sons, stepped into the witness stand. "He said we couldn't afford to pay tuition," Daniel testified, his voice shaking. "He said the family owed money, that we all had to make a sacrifice. I worked 2 jobs in order to pay for college, because I trusted him. And then I discovered that he was flying first class and purchasing property in other people's names." His words struck the courtroom with the force of a dagger. Even Kody, who had hitherto been stoic, appeared shaken. Kent concluded the prosecution case with a flourish of drama, a chronology of deceit. It was a large graphical chart displayed on a screen, listing all of the major deals, all of the offshore accounts, all of the peculiar emails, and all of the fibs spun over the period of almost 10 years. This was not one poor choice, she stated. This was a pattern, deliberate, calculated, and for the benefit of one man at the cost of everyone else. Kody's defense attorneys attempted to resist. They claimed that the accounts were included in strategic tax planning, that the shell companies were legitimate, and that anything financial Kody did was within his legal prerogative as the leader of their companies. But the evidence was unavoidable. Even when they attempted to imply that the wives had access to the accounts, Kent prevailed with signed documents to the contrary. The longer they quibbled, the shakier their argument sounded. By day's end, the prosecution had constructed this lurid portrait. A man who employed love as a means of manipulation, who wrapped greed in the guise of faith and family, and who thought he was clever enough to get away with it. The gallery hummed as court recessed, the reporters scrambling to meet deadlines. It was apparent to all in attendance that the trial was no longer merely about swiped funds. It was about the destruction of myth. The myth of Kody Brown, good family man and husband. In its stead stood reality, a man who would betray his wives, his children, and the very values he professed to hold in esteem for a sense of power and riches. As Kody was led out of the courtroom, he did not look anyone in the eye. His wives, his kids, even the cameras. For the first time ever, his signature swagger appeared to waver. The facts had been revealed, and the world now knew the truth. And even as the verdict loomed still weeks away, one thing had become irrevocably clear. Kody Brown's meticulously built kingdom was coming apart at the seams, and no amount of denial would protect him from the reckoning that was inevitable. The third day of trial dawned under a gray, cloudy sky that reflected the somber mood within the courtroom. The prosecution evidence had been incendiary. Foreign accounts, shell corporations, condemnatory emails, and heart-wrenching witnesses from Kody's wives and children had rattled the pillars of his defense. And yet, in spite of the mountain of proof piled against him, Kody Brown entered the court with his chin slightly higher than ever before. He had dedicated decades to dictating the story of his family's existence, and he was intent on doing the same here. Now it was his turn. Defense was prepared to strike back. The courtroom was filled again. Reporters filled the aisles, cameras popped, and murmurs hummed through the gallery. Some onlookers attended to witness justice, others to witness the show, but everybody knew this was the moment of truth. The prosecution had made Kody out to be a ruthless mastermind of deceit. Now his defense team, led by seasoned attorney Thomas Reed, would attempt to strip away that portrait bit by bit. Reed was famous for his cool but merciless courtroom demeanor, a man who could turn a bad guy into a victim and plant doubt where none appeared conceivable. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Reed began in his opening statement, pacing deliberately before the jury box. The prosecution has presented a dramatic story, one filled with betrayal, manipulation and theft. But that's all it is. A story, and like many stories, it's built on selective facts, exaggerated emotions, and assumptions that don't hold up under scrutiny. My client, Kody Brown, is not a thief. He is not a criminal. He is a man who dedicated his life to his family, who made financial decisions, sometimes difficult ones, always with the goal of securing their future. Reed's tone was calm, his cadence crisp. He reminded the jury that Kody had been the chief decision-maker in a complicated multi-member family. Managing a family of more than 20 people isn't easy, he contended. There were hundreds of joint ventures, companies and investments, and Mr. Brown had to make fast strategic decisions. Did he shuffle money? Yes. Did he set up accounts? Definitely. But all he did was legal, and all he did was for them. The defense's first witness was Kody Brown himself. Everyone watched him as he stepped into the witness box. His face was composed, his suit immaculately pressed, but attention lay hidden beneath. A man who was aware that the words he uttered could win or lose his case. Following the swearing of the oath, he clasped his hands together and addressed the jury, as if addressing them directly. I understand how this must appear. Kody started, his tone level but a little restrained. I understand there's a story out there that I'm some kind of monster who robbed his family. But the reality is a little more complex than that. We had money troubles, we had opportunities, and sometimes I had to make choices that people didn't see at the time. But I always did what I thought was best for my family. Reed walked him through his testimony, as gently as possible, allowing Kody room to come across, not as a conniving scammer, but a misunderstood patriarch. Kody described the shell companies as being used for tax efficiency and liability protection. The offshore accounts, a normal component of international investment strategy. The missing funds, reinvested into projects that would ultimately benefit the entire family. I never had the intention to mislead anyone, he maintained. I explained to them that we were constructing something larger, a legacy. At times this meant risking things they could not comprehend. But I had faith that the end would be worth it. Reed then addressed the most incriminating piece of evidence, the emails. Mr. Brown, he explained, the prosecution had produced an email in which you called your wives liabilities. What is that all about? Kody sighed with the look of hurt of having his misunderstanding weigh so heavily upon him. That email was misinterpreted. I was speaking of how some investments are regarded on paper, legally and in terms of money. It had nothing to do with how I felt toward my family. Anyone who knows me knows how much I love them. Referring to the line, they'll never find the accounts. Kody denied it was serious. It was sarcasm. He forced a smile. A poor choice of words. I was frustrated and venting. It wasn't literal. Even after his defenses, cross-examination by prosecutor Laura Kent was merciless. Mr. Brown, she said walking slowly in front of him, if you really wanted these funds to go toward your family, why were they never told about these accounts? Kody hesitated before speaking. Because I didn't want to worry them. These were sophisticated financial choices, and I didn't want to bog them down with the information. Kent pushed again. So instead, you chose to conceal those facts altogether, even going all the way to buy property in other people's names. Kody shifted nervously, but remained on his defense. They were part of a long-term investment plan. The names were for security and privacy. The jury listened intently, their faces revealing disbelief. The more Kody spoke, the more his words sounded rehearsed excuses rather than true explanations. Yet Reed understood that the aim was not to make them believe in Kody's innocence per se. It was to sow reasonable doubt, and for that, they would require more than Kody's own words. The defense's second maneuver was to call into question the credibility and motives of the plaintiffs, the wives themselves. Reed argued that the suit was more about vengeance than justice. These are relationships that ended badly, he explained to the jury. There's resentment, there's anger, and now there's a financial incentive to rewrite history. He highlighted Christine's departure from the marriage, Meri's strained relationship with Kody, and Janelle's public criticisms of him. This case, Reed said, is as much about broken hearts as it is about bank accounts. They even called in a defense-retained forensic accountant, who testified that several of the financial transactions cited by the prosecution as suspicious were within legal norms, and not unusual for complicated family-owned businesses. The accountant contended that so-called missing money might be explained by reinvestment, tax deferments, and loans. From a financial standpoint, he concluded, there's no definite proof of embezzlement here. Reed also tried to make Kody seem more human by calling a number of character witnesses, old buddies, business colleagues, even a couple of his children who still stood by him. One of Kody's former business partners characterized Kody as ambitious, perhaps too ambitious, but always with his family's best interest at heart. Another said that Kody himself had lent them money in a lean time, portraying him as selfless and charitable. But for each sympathetic testimony, there was a ready prosecution rebuttal. They impugned the account's impartiality, turning up evidence that his company had been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by Kody's firms. They reminded the jury that business partners didn't answer to Kody, his wives did, and they pointed out the obvious gap between Kody's words and deeds. He says he did it for the family, Kent protested in a heated cross-examination. But none of them profited from these secret accounts. None of them. The most poignant moment was at the end of the day when Kent had one last bit of evidence. An audio recording of a telephone conversation between him and one of Kody's close friends, recorded during the investigation. On it, Kody was heard complaining about his wives. "They'll never get it," he complained. "I worked hard for that money. I deserve to keep it." The courtroom stilled. The words hung in mid-air like a confession. Kody's attorney protested that the statement was taken out of context, but the harm was done. For the first time, the jury caught a glimpse of the actual man behind the defense's polished story. Not a misjudged provider, but a man who believed he was entitled to the money, no matter to whom else it belonged. As the defense rested its case, the courtroom atmosphere was complex. They had tried their best to retell the story, deflect blame, create doubt, and tug at the jury's sense of justice. They had painted Kody as a flawed yet well-meaning father, a man swamped by the burdens of responsibility, a victim of vindictive ex-wives, determined to bring down his name. And although they had raised doubts for sure, the core of the prosecution case was not undone. The proof of deceit was too great, the evidence in the form of testimony damning, the inconsistencies in Kody's narrative impossible to dispute. As the court rose for the day that evening, public debate was split. Some accepted Kody's account, firmly believing that the wives were out for revenge. Others viewed his evidence as a last-ditch effort to try and rewrite history. But one thing was for sure, the defense had purchased Kody time. They had made things more complicated, fudged the facts, and sowed just enough seeds of uncertainty to leave the verdict up in the air. And in a courtroom, at times it only took doubt. And as Kody emerged from the courthouse, he grinned weakly for the press, but his eyes gave away the tension churning beneath. He knew the fight was far from over. Undefined. The prosecution had opened him up for bleeding. Undefined. The defense had fired back. Undefined. But the true war, the one to his reputation, his wealth, and potentially his liberty, was only starting. Undefined. In the days ahead, the words of those whom he had long referred to as family would either kill him off for good or give him the very narrowest of roads to redemption. The courtroom was packed when the fourth week of the trial opened. Individuals stood in line outside for hours before the doors were opened, hoping to glimpse even briefly the developing court battle that had turned a previously popular family into a war zone of deception. The atmosphere was thick with expectation, because today, attention would move from documents, bank records, and terms of finance to something so much more primal, so much more intense. The testimony of those who had experienced Kody Brown's presumed deception. This was the day that the wives, the women who had established a life, a family, a future with him, would have their say. And the world was going to witness a part of this tale which no spreadsheet ever could. Since the judge walked in, the room had been shrouded in somber silence. Kody sat stiffly at the defense table, his fists clasped tightly enough to turn his knuckles white. He had known this day would be merciless. He had listened to the evidence, endured the prosecutor's torrents, and justified his choices with practiced assurance. But nothing could fully prepare him for what was about to transpire. The group outrage, suffering, and grief of the folk he had previously vowed to love and defend. Meri Brown, the lady he had been with the longest, his first wife, his original spouse, and the lady who had maintained faith in the plural marriage dream from the very beginning, took the first turn at the stand. Her marriage to Kody had been tumultuous for years, plagued by emotional estrangement and public embarrassment following her notorious catfishing scandal. Yet today, there was not one note of bitterness in her tone, only deep disillusionment. "I believed in him," she whispered, looking at the jury instead of Kody. "I believed in the family we were creating. I believed everything he told me about trust and harmony. And all along he was constructing something else. A life without us." Meri told about how she began questioning Kody's finances years ago. She remembered signing papers without explanation, being advised of what accounts were complicated or not relevant, and being left out of business meetings. "I thought I was being left out of details," she confessed. "Now I know I was being kept in the dark intentionally." Her voice broke when she recounted how she discovered the secret accounts. "It wasn't only money," she said, her hands shaking ever so slightly. "It was every choice we made, every compromise we accepted, every aspiration we believed we were creating together. All of it constructed on lies." Then Janelle, the wife famed for her calm and for acting as the family's unofficial accountant. If Meri's testimony was raw, Janelle's was clinical. A careful and clinical deconstruction of Kody's story. She produced years of books she had maintained, spreadsheets detailing every source of income, every investment, every expense. We functioned as a unit, she testified. At least I thought so. But there had been deals I had never sanctioned, accounts I had never been aware of, and decisions that conflicted straight away with our financial strategies. She explained to the court how Kody had bullied her into taking loans to fund property purchases, while secretly siphoning off hundreds of thousands into private investment. He said, "We needed to cut back," she added, acidly. Meanwhile, he was purchasing luxury cars and investing in companies we had no interest in. But Christine's testimony changed the vibe in the room in a profound way. She strode to the witness stand with her head held high. No longer the woman who had begged for validation and affection, but someone who had regained her power. Christine had already emerged as a public figure of independence since divorcing Kody. But now she was something else entirely. A whistleblower. "I gave this man my life," she started out, her voice firm and unshakable. "I raised 6 children with him. I built a home, a family, a future, and he betrayed it all, not only by accepting money, but by orchestrating his exit while we were still constructing the dream he sold us." Christine recounts the evening she found the emails revealing Kody's offshore accounts. "I recall sitting in front of the screen, rereading his words again and again, words of breaking up and preventing them from knowing. That's when I realized it was over. It was no longer a family. It was a scam." She took a deep breath before laying down a line that would resonate in the courtroom. "This is not about money. This is about a man who used love as an excuse for control." Then Robyn, the wife many faulted for the fall of the Brown family. Her romance with Kody had long been contentious. The sole legal wife, the one he appeared to favor over the others, the one many suspected was in on his control. But Robyn's testimony muddied the picture. She confirmed that she was aware of some accounts, but said she had no idea how large Kody's activities were. "He told me it was for our future," she said, her voice shaking. "I trusted him. I believed him, and now I see I was just as duped as they were." The prosecution leaned hard on her over inconsistencies. Why had she signed documents with shell company connections? Why had she profited from some of those high-end purchases? Robyn welled up in tears. "I didn't ask questions," she confessed. "I did not want to ask questions. Because if I did, I'd have to confront reality, that the man I loved may not be who I thought he was." The children followed the wives. Their testimonies were maybe the worst of all because they revealed the ripple effects of Kody's actions beyond monetary betrayal. Daniel Brown, Kody's grown son, went on the stand and testified with anger and grief. "He told us we were broke," Daniel testified. "He explained to us that we would have to give up things, that we couldn't afford college or new clothes, or even simple things at times, and I listened to him. I had 2 jobs to help pay for my education. I saw my mom weeping over bills. Then I discover he was traveling first class, purchasing vacation homes and concealing millions. How do you ever forgive that?" Another daughter testified that she had delayed her wedding because Kody said the family couldn't afford it. The same year he bought a $1.2 million house in a fake name. "It wasn't about the money," she spoke softly. "It was the lies." Absolutely every word that came out of his mouth was a lie. The defense tried to discredit the testimony, implying that the wives were over-dramatizing their misery, and the children were still too young to grasp the intricacies of money management. But the force of their words was not to be denied. Jurors brushed away tears. Even some of the fans who had begun to root for Kody now shook their heads with revulsion. And for the first time the confidence of Kody seemed to waver. He also shunned eye contact with his wives, played with his tie, and gazed at the floor while their words rained around him. The prosecution ended the day on a strong note by using a compelling montage of evidence intertwined with the testimonies. A timeline appeared on the courtroom screens, representing major events in the family life: children being born, houses being bought, businesses being started, all set against the dates of clandestine transfers and secret investments. The argument was clear. While the family were building a life together, Kody was constructing an exit strategy. He wasn't merely pilfering cash. He was stealing trust, stealing futures, stealing years of sacrifice and faith. In her final statement of the day, prosecutor Laura Kent addressed the jury directly. You've heard their stories. You've seen their pain. These are not bitter ex-wives or angry children seeking revenge. These are victims of betrayal. A betrayal orchestrated, purposefully planned, and perpetrated by the one human being they could have trusted most. This case is not about family drama. It's about fraud. It's about theft. It's about justice. The courtroom fell silent in shock as the judge recessed for the day. On the steps outside, reporters surged, clamoring to catch reactions. Meri and Janelle departed side by side, hands clasped together, a tiny gesture of unity after all these years of schism. Christine gave a few words to the media, stating, "We didn't want this. We never wanted it to come to this. But we deserve the truth. We deserve accountability." Even Robyn, usually quiet in public, gave a curt statement. "I loved him, I trusted him. And I'm still trying to understand how we got here." Kody left through the side door, protected by his lawyers, and as quiet as stone. His face had gone pale, his eyes hollow. He had endured a lot in his life. Public humiliation, broken relationships, lost trust, but not this. This was not a TV plot, or a family disagreement. This was a courtroom. And this time, there were repercussions for what he did. As evening descended on the courthouse, the world held its breath for the next chapter. But one thing was certain already. The testimony had altered everything. The words of the wives had stripped down Kody's final defenses, revealing the man behind the carefully constructed mask. The jury hadn't merely heard about money and papers. They had sensed the pain, the betrayal, the desolation, and once such feelings set in within a courtroom, it is difficult to disregard. The case was not about establishing innocence or guilt anymore. It had become a reckoning, a public and intensely personal condemnation of a man who had lived his life on the principles of trust and destroyed it in the name of greed. The last week of the trial came with the type of tension that could be sensed in the air long before anyone walked through the door of the courtroom. Reporters had been sleeping in their cars for days, and the courthouse steps were a mad scene. Satellite trucks, camera crews, legal commentators theorizing on live television, and scores of rubberneckers hoping to see history made. This was no longer merely a trial. It had become an event, a public accounting for a man who had once preached unity, family, and common faith. Now Kody Brown was poised to lose it all. His fortune, his reputation, and the remaining bits of faith from those who once addressed him as husband and father. Within the courtroom, the mood was replete with subdued tension. The air was thicker, the silence deeper, as if all of the people in the room intuited the enormity of what was about to transpire. Following weeks of testimony, financial records, tearful admissions, and high-drama confrontations, the arguments and accusations were finished. Now it came down to the last act, the closing arguments, the jury deliberation, and the verdict that would shape the rest of Kody's life. Prosecutor Laura Kent stood up first. She had been merciless during the trial, spinning a tapestry of proof that painted Kody as a man who had used love for a price. But today her tone was changed. It was subdued, chillier, more measured, the tone of someone giving the coup de grace. She moved to the middle of the courtroom, turned and faced the jury, paused, allowing the silence to linger long enough for all the people in the room to sense the seriousness of the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice determined but controlled, "through the past few weeks you have heard a tale of trust and betrayal, of promises given and promises broken. But this is not a tale, this is the truth. It is the truth of 4 women who trusted a man who deceived them. It is the truth of children who made sacrifices, because they were informed that there was no money, yet millions were being secreted away in hidden accounts. And it is the truth of a man, this man, who employed his family as not partners in life but instruments to satisfy his greed." She moved slowly to the exhibits table, and held up one of the printed emails the jury had previously been shown during the trial. The one where Kody had written, "They'll never find the accounts if it's under the new LLC." Kent's tone grew brusquer. "These aren't words, a loving husband or responsible father. These are words of a man orchestrating a fraud, a man concealing other people's money. A man who knew what he was doing. Kent reeled off the incriminating facts in precise detail. The offshore accounts, the shell corporations, the false name luxury property buys. She recalled Janelle's spreadsheets, Christine's findings, and Daniel's account of being refused tuition funds. She replayed key moments of testimony in their minds. Meri's heartbreak, Robyn's reluctant admissions, the children's anger and pain. Every piece of evidence, she said, points to a deliberate, calculated plan to enrich himself at the expense of those who trusted him most. Then Kent delivered the emotional punch, the one that would linger in the jury's minds as they deliberated. This case isn't about dollars and cents. It's about trust. The most sacred trust between people who share a life together. Kody Brown breached that trust. He stole from his wives. He lied to his children. And when he got caught, he pleaded it was a misunderstanding. But you know better, you have seen the evidence. You have heard the truth. And now it is your responsibility to mete out justice. The room was hushed as Kent resumed her seat. Even those who had previously stood up for Kody were fighting to maintain eye contact now. His well-practiced calm was starting to shatter. His jaw was tight, his respirations shallow. He knew the prosecution's argument was strong, and he knew the defense would need to perform a miracle to defend against it. Thomas Reed, Kody's lawyer, stood up slowly on behalf of the defense's closing argument. He was calm, but his expression carried a weight that indicated he knew what the uphill fight would be like. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I understand what you're thinking. I know the image that has been painted by the prosecution. But I'm here to remind you that this case, as with all cases, is not about emotion, it's about evidence. And the evidence does not demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that my client has committed a crime." Reed contended the economic decisions Kody made were legal and within his rights as the head of the family enterprises. He also reminded them that some of the transactions and accounts were familiar to at least one of the wives, that no criminal complaints had been brought, and that the family's finances were so much more complex than the prosecution would have them believe. Were mistakes made? Perhaps, Reed conceded. Were there choices that in retrospect could have been explained differently? Absolutely. But poor communication and mistakes do not amount to fraud. He also came back to the defense's main theme, that the suit was driven by personal bitterness and not wrongdoing. Ask yourselves, he told them, would this case have existed if these relationships didn't collapse, if Christine hadn't departed, if the show didn't finish, if there weren't hurt feelings and bitterness? The prosecution wants you to perceive greed. I see a family disintegrating and blaming one person for their hurts. Reed concluded with a call for compassion. Kody Brown is not perfect. None of us are. But he is not a criminal. He is a man who attempted, perhaps imperfectly, to take care of his family. And he does not deserve to have his life ruined by misunderstandings and miscommunications. I urge you to look beyond the emotion and see the facts. And when you do, the only fair verdict is one for my client. It was a good closing, measured, humanizing, and skillfully constructed to sow seeds of doubt. But if it would be enough was yet to be determined. The jury was instructed by the judge, and then they were excused to deliberate. Hours became a day. The courthouse swarmed with nervous activity. Reporters hypothesized at length. Defenders and detractors of Kody milled about outside, debating guilt or innocence. In the deliberation room, 12 average citizens waded through weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotion. They argued whether Kody's behavior was criminal or simply unethical, intentional or negligent, malicious or misinformed. After close to 18 hours of deliberation, the judge was handed a note. The jury had made their verdict. The courtroom was filled to capacity as the jury returned. Every face was strained. Every breath suspended. Kody sat rigidly at the defense table, his fists tight together. Christine and Janelle sat together, their faces set. Meri gazed down at the table, her fingers shaking slightly. Robyn dabbed at a tear before the judge said a word. "Will the foreperson please rise?" the judge said. A woman in her 50s stood, holding a folded sheet of paper in her hands. Her voice was calm, but there was a gravity in it that made the room feel even heavier. "In the matter of Brown versus Brown," she began. We, the jury, find the defendant, Kody Brown. She paused. The silence stretching impossibly long. Liable for embezzlement and financial fraud. A sound wave swept over the courtroom. Gasps, whispers, even some sobs. Christine had her eyes closed, silently crying tears down her face. Janelle exhaled, her shoulders drooping in relief. Meri took her hand, clasping it fiercely. Robyn cried outright, warring between heartbreak and vindication. Kody did not move. His face blanched, his lips pursed into a thin line, his eyes on a point on the table before him. It was done. The jury had delivered their verdict. The judge thanked the jury for their time and announced that a special hearing would be held to decide on financial compensation. Initial estimates had Kody facing possible orders to repay over $2.3 million, plus interest and attorney fees, and potentially criminal investigation by federal officials. But the actual penalty wasn't financial. It was the ruination of all that Kody had created. The shattering of his public image, the erosion of his family's trust, the irreversible destruction of his legacy. As the courtroom broke open, Christine paused to address the press. This wasn't ever about revenge, she said. It was about the truth. And today the truth was told. Janelle chimed in. We did this for our children, for their future. They deserve to know that justice matters. Even Meri, who had kept quiet for the most part, murmured quietly into a group of microphones. I hope he learns from this. I hope he finally gets it. The hurt he's inflicted. Kody departed from the courthouse via a rear entrance, escorted by security guards, deflecting shouted queries from reporters. Cameras snapped him hurrying toward a waiting vehicle, his face impassive, his once self-assured gait now hesitant. For a man who'd spent decades dictating his own story, the silence was oppressive. Outside, the public response was immediate and polarized. Some viewed Kody as a manipulator, who had finally been brought to justice. Others viewed him as a fallen man corrupted by bitter ex-partners. But no matter opinion, there was one thing for certain. The verdict had altered everything. The Brown family would never be the same. The empire Kody built on the pillars of plural marriage, trust, and mutual faith was lost, consumed by a legacy of betrayal, greed, and public shame. By nightfall, the courthouse was vacant, but the reverberations of the trial still resonated. In the headlines on social media, in the dinner conversation nationwide, and in a silent corner of an hotel room miles distant, Kody Brown sat alone for the first time in years, gazing up at the ceiling, wrestling with a reality he could no longer hide from the family. He had once manipulated now stood as one against him, and the future he had attempted to establish on a foundation of deceit had collapsed beneath the crushing force of justice. The gavel had finally dropped, and its resounding echo signaled the end of an era, not only for the Browns, but for the myth of power upon which Kody had constructed his existence.